was worth saving.
The brother of Mary and Martha is extremely ill. As the loving sisters we know them to be, we imagine they have done everything. They have called the local doctors, they have made gallon upon gallon of chicken noodle soup. Still, it is to no avail. Their brother, Lazarus, continues to grow weaker. Still, Mary and Martha are not without hope. They have an ace up the sleeve, if you will. They have a friend named Jesus. Now, this is a strange word, but it's important in John's gospel. Obviously, Jesus has lots of people who listen to him. He literally speaks to thousands of people. That's how popular he is. But those people in John's gospel aren't considered friends. Even the disciples, the people who travel with him in John's gospel for months upon months at a time, the people who are with him 24 hours a day, it isn't until the end of the ministry of Jesus that they are referred to as his friends. No, in John's gospel, the few friends that Jesus have are all in this story. It's Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. So when Mary and Martha send word to Jesus that his friend Lazarus is ill, they expect him to come running. After all, Jesus heals everybody. Jesus heals faithful Hebrew people. Jesus heals not so faithful Hebrew people. He heals Samaritans. He heals Roman soldiers, for goodness sake. Of course, Jesus is going to come and heal Lazarus, except he doesn't. Jesus, for reasons that are not fully disclosed in John's gospel, is late, like really late. Like Lazarus is already dead late. In fact, Jesus is so late, he misses the funeral. When Jesus finally arrives, Mary and Martha are gathering with other family members and friends, still waiting for Jesus to show up. They've had the funeral. They've actually laid the body of Lazarus to rest. When Martha hears that Jesus has finally arrived, she leaves the house and she goes out to meet him. I imagine that with fire in her eyes and her finger in his chest, she goes up to Jesus and says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Martha is angry. She's angry at the situation. There's nothing fair about this. This is her brother after all. And Jesus was supposed to be his friend. She counted on Jesus. She trusted Jesus to show up. My hunch is you can relate. There's some sort of situation in your life that was just patently unfair by any definition of the word, and you felt frustrated. You felt this wrath pouring out of you. You just had to direct it at someone. We've all been in those situations where life just isn't fair. Notice what Jesus does. Jesus doesn't say, "Martha, why don't you take a few deep breaths and gather your composure at this moment?" Jesus doesn't do anything that would make him back up from Martha. Instead, Jesus draws close. Jesus enters into a conversation with her. Jesus begins to answer some of her really hard questions. In fact, he throws some back to her, and they go back and forth. And by the end of the conversation, Martha's anger is gone. Jesus has taken it from her. What is more, these questions that are floating around in her mind, all of a sudden Martha's starting to think, maybe, just maybe, there's something going on here greater than I could have possibly imagined. Then Jesus takes Martha back to the house. Mary this time comes out. When Mary sees Jesus, she says the same words her sister just spoke, but the tone is completely different. She walks up to Jesus, and there's no finger pointing here now. There's just a broken voice and tears in her eyes. She says, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." And when she says those final words, she collapses to the ground. Mary is overwhelmed by grief. The sadness is so strong, it drops her to the ground. She can barely move. My hunch is some of you can relate to Mary. There's probably been a moment in your life where the sadness just felt like it was so great you couldn't barely move. It feels like a 2,000-pound weight just resting on your shoulders. You understand Mary's grief, which is why you need to pay special attention to what Jesus does. Jesus doesn't pat Mary on the shoulder and say, "Mary, this is bad now, but in 7 or 8 months, you're going to be feeling better." Jesus doesn't even reach into his pocket and give her a tissue and say, there, Mary." No, none of those things are done by Jesus. Instead, what does Jesus do? Jesus falls to the ground and Jesus weeps with Mary. Back in the old days of confirmation, I used to ask young people to do the same thing year after year. They were expected to memorize a single Bible verse. The hope, of course, is that they would have found over their 2.5 years of confirmation one story in the Bible that was so meaningful, so impactful, that would resonate so deeply with them that they would grab a Bible verse out of that story and take with them for the rest of their life. Of course, there was always one kid that he would stand up, and yes, it was always a he. He would stand up in front of family members and friends, and we get to the end of the questions, and I would say, so what's your favorite Bible verse? What's your life verse? And then with this annoying grin on his face, he would say, John 11:35. Ha ha ha. He'd giggle with his buddies. John 11:35. Jesus wept. Depending on your translation, this is the shortest verse in the Bible. But I always thought the joke was on them. Because if you're going to memorize one verse of the Bible, there are far less desirable verses to memorize. John 11:35, Jesus wept. Think about what this tells us about God. That we serve a God who loves us so much that he refuses to stand back from Mary in the midst of her grief. That we serve a God who loves us so much that in the midst of our grief, in the midst of our sorrow, Jesus actually weeps with us. That's how much we are loved. Of course, this story doesn't just end with Jesus comforting Mary and Martha. It doesn't end with Jesus taking Martha's anger or weeping with Mary. No, when Martha's anger is gone, when Mary has no more tears left to shed, Jesus takes them both by the hand and they go to the cemetery. And there, with a group of onlookers wondering what in the world is going on, Jesus insists to the pallbearers to remove the stone to the tomb of Lazarus. Jesus then says a prayer and with a loud voice cries, Lazarus, come out. And in that moment, the dead man is raised to new life. Jesus says, unbind him and let him go. Friends, this is the moment. This is the moment that changes everything in the Gospel of John. Historically speaking, this is the moment that leads to the cross. Theologically speaking, this is the moment, this is the story that helps us understand what the cross is all about. Let me explain. Historically, this leads us to the cross because this is the moment. The religious leaders who are there mourning the death of Lazarus look around and say to one another, we have to end this. They have allowed Jesus to teach. They have allowed Jesus to heal, even healing on the Sabbath. It feels like Jesus is always flirting with danger. He's always changing or stretching the rules. But this will not stand. The moment Jesus starts raising people from the dead, he's putting everything at risk. This is just too much. This is too revolutionary. This is dangerous stuff. This is the moment that the religious leaders decide he must die. He must be crucified. Historically, this is the moment that leads to the death of Jesus, but theologically, this is the story that helps us understand what the cross is all about. Because what is the cross? The cross is the moment where God, in the person of Jesus Christ, draws near, where God takes our anger, our guilt, our shame, our sin. God takes it upon himself in the person of Jesus and puts those things to death. In the cross, we see that we have a God who loves us so much. He refuses to stand back. He enters into the depths of our sorrow, even saying, I will go with you wherever you go, including into death itself. I will be there with you and for you. I suppose that would be enough to know that a God that we serve loves us this much. But friends, just like the story of Lazarus doesn't end with Jesus simply comforting Mary and Martha, we know the story of Jesus doesn't simply end with the cross. 3 days later, Jesus is raised to new life. Death does not get the final word in the story of Lazarus, thanks to Jesus and the Father, just like death doesn't get the last word in the story of Jesus, thanks to the Father in heaven. Which means, dear friends in Christ, death doesn't get the final word in any of our stories. Thanks to Jesus, we have the promise that when we close our eyes for the final time, Jesus will be there, calling us by name, raising us anew.
You thought I was worth saving.